Today, I'm going to tell you about the history of ships in Star Wars and their classification. More than 1,000 models and types of Star Wars ships have been invented. The first armed starships of the young races and peoples of the galaxy appeared before the Galactic Republic came into existence. Young races are the races that appeared and developed after the old ones left the galactic arena. Rakata, Gree, Kilik, Kuat, Sharu, Kolumi, Celestials aka Architects, and some others. In the early days of warships, there were simply no classifications of young races. Sometimes there was not even a division into combat and transport ships. In fact, we don't have much information about ancient ships except for a few ships that appeared in a very good series of comics and in the novel Into the Void. Warriors of antiquity often have brief and sometimes not so brief descriptions in sources. We know some information about the personalities of the rulers, but what exactly they fought on back then is, alas, almost unknown. Moreover, we do not know about warships even in such an interesting period as Pius Dea. With their great crusades, the imperium of mankind, religious lunacy, exterminatus, mass exterminations of Xenos, the divinity of the ruler. In short, in ancient times, Star Wars had pretty much the same things going on as the Warhammer universe, only without the space troopers, techno-geeks, and warp. Although other weapons were similar, laser guns, macro cannons. A lot of information about warships thanks to books, comics, reference books, and KOTOR games we only have from the beginning of the Mandalorian Wars and the First Great Sith War. That's the period we're going to start with. There will be a very distinctive cross-section, as during this time the Galactic Republic had both new ships in service as well as ships of older designs, some of which had served the Republic for thousands of years. Yes, in ancient times, even in Star Wars, ships served for a long time. Let's start with the Galactic Republic, as it was in the Republic that the classes gunboat, corvette, frigate, cruiser, line cruiser, and battleship appeared. That is the typical fantasy and real-world classes. The oldest ships in service with the Republic at the time of the Great Sith War and the Hyperspace War were the Cal battleships, truly huge ships of 3 kilometers in length, and characteristically they weren't built by the Republic. The Cal-class battleship was the most valuable trophy the Republic obtained after winning the war with the Kumuri Empire. Such a state was around 10,000 years ago, before the events of the movies. The Galactic Republic continued to expand rapidly in those years, peacefully annexing those who wanted to join and kicking those who didn't want to join nicely until they did. All in the name of democracy and human rights, of course. After defeating Emperor Val Kumari, the Republic fairly appropriated all the Empire's ships as part of the retribution. The Republicans were very impressed by the Cal-class battleships because their own ships, classified as battleships, in those years rarely exceeded 300 meters in length, and cruisers were usually 150, 200 meters long. And here was a 3-kilometer-long hulk, and even with such armament. Cal-class battleships were so huge because of the masses of driver guns, which fired shells with different fillings, or, if there were no shells at hand, asteroids. With the help of such Wunderwaffes, the Republicans won the 10th Alsacan conflicts. Fighting the Alsacan state had been a traditional pastime for the Republic for many thousands of years. The cannons of Cal battleships, by the way, were one of the reasons for the planetary shields, to prevent any scoundrels from throwing rocks on their heads. In Republic shipbuilding, the Callus were the exception to the general rule, and were very rarely built in Republic shipyards. And the ships that were already available, including trophy ships, were carefully preserved by the Republic for thousands of years. In addition to the Cal, the Republic also built giants like these. By the way, I think fans of the universe of pathos, endurance, and eternal war have already paid attention to the design features of ancient ships in Star Wars. In some places, well, very similar to flying Catholic cathedrals from the Warhammer universe. The spires, the angular design. Surprisingly, at least one such battleship in some working condition survived into the movie period. I'm talking about the Cal Ambre. Of course, it hasn't been a warship for a long time. Some clever guys turned it into a casino. The ship is permanently parked in orbit around the Moonrove in the Bramior system. It's in the inner ring, square M9. It was a very prestigious place. So how did the Galactic Republic categorize warships? There were two systems. The first was the size, namely the internal volume, and the second was the purpose of the ship. If with the second everything is clear, then in the first case, gradation was made only by length. Inside the universe itself, everything was somewhat different. The inhabitants of a galaxy far, far away were oriented by internal volume. The larger it was, the more weapons and equipment could be placed, the more powerful shields and reactor could be placed. The Cals participated in the Great Hyperspace War, where they confronted the fleet of the Sith Empire. The followers of the dark side of the Force were minimalist in those years. The Sith's largest heavy warships at the time were Daraphan-class battleships. It means devourer in the Sith language. Incidentally, that's also how the first Ziston-type serialized Star Destroyer was named in new canon. It was the one that destroyed the planet Kijimi in Episode 9. It's hard to call it a carryover from the expanded universe. It's more like a tribute of the movie writers to the old fans. But let's go back in time. This marvel of Sith's thought, which was called Daraphan, was only 215 meters long. In the movie period, even corvettes were larger. In this light, it is very telling that the old Daraphans, which survived to the time of Revan and Malak, were classified by the Republic military as frigates only, based on the size and firepower of this pocket battleship. Other Sith's ships of those years could not boast of their size either. For example, a Sith escort gunboat was 75 meters long, landing craft 200, 230 meters, and so on. Only the flagship line ships of the Sith Lords could reach half a kilometer in length. Back to the Republic. Its fleet wasn't always dominated by giants either. Shortly before the Great Sith War, the Galactic Republic fleet relied on relatively small ships. They were easier to build, cheaper, and so you could build a lot of them and then chase pirates. But you can't chase pirates on a huge battleship. Here are a few examples. Let's start with the smallest Foray-class blockade runner. The type of ship Foray can be translated as foray, raid. In the Republican classification system of those years, they were frigates. Characteristically, then corvettes in the Republican Navy were not singled out as a separate class. Although in the fleets of some states that were part of the Republic, there were ships of the corvette class, and sometimes even larger than the frigate Foray. The first ones entered service with the Republican Navy shortly before the Mandalorian Wars. Their original mission was to escort convoys, hunt pirates, and generally ensure the safety of trade routes. As the Mandalorians began to invade the Republic, these ships turned from convoy escorts to raiders. The Mandalorian communications, which were poorly guarded, provided an excellent opportunity for hooliganism in the Mandalorian rear. In major battles, Forus served as escort and reinforcement ships for Hammerhead-type cruisers. Another typical ship of this period was the Praetorian-class frigates, the direct predecessor of the Hammerheads and Thranta. It was slightly larger than the Forays, measuring only 180 meters in length. Prior to a series of large-scale and bloody wars, the Praetorian was also engaged in cruising and patrol service. By the time of the All-Galactic Wars, here with these guys in stylish armor, the obsolete Praetorians were gradually being supplanted by the Hammerheads, which were already considered cruisers. They were up to 315 meters long. Not much difference in size between cruisers and frigates, is it? Because of this, a number of contemporaries still referred to Hammerheads as frigates. And in general, in the Republic of those years, the difference between frigates and cruisers, both in purpose, size, and firepower, was small, and sometimes there was no difference at all. Characteristically, in the future, 300 years later, during the events of Sabal Utor, Hammerhead's successor, a ship like the Thranta, was already considered a corvette in the Republic Navy. Though characteristically, some contemporaries who were not Republicans categorized the Thranta as a frigate class. This can be seen in the game itself. But back to the period of Revan and Malak. The newest warship of those times was the 600-meter interdictor cruiser. With its introduction, Hammerhead moved into the light cruiser class. The interdictor was built for the Republic Navy and was the backbone of the fleets of the Sith empires of Darth Revan and Darth Malak. Favor, Starforge, could produce them in huge quantities like hotcakes. You're looking at a CGS dreadnought. CGS is the manufacturer's acronym for Core Galaxy Systems. It was 900 meters long. These angular, surly-looking ships, bristling with spikes of antennae and sensors, had served for years in the ancient Galactic Republic Navy. By the start of the Great Sith War, which lasted from 4000 to 3996 before Yavin, they were obsolete and mostly scrapped. Why dreadnoughts? Such a term was obsolete by the time of the new Sith Wars and was not used in the Republic classification. It was a heavy cruiser by the classification of the time, although its armament corresponded to that of a battleship. The larger ships of the period were line cruisers and battleships. At the beginning of the Great Sith War, they were such relic monster battleships, over a kilometer long, which were always the flagships of fleets and squadrons and formed the core of the fleet in major battles. By the time the war began, they were also obsolete. They were replaced by the Centurion-class battlecruisers, a huge ship, 1,200 meters long. No one built larger production warships in those years, except the Mandalorians. Well, those guys like big guns. Standing out in all of this are the truly huge command and staff ships of the impregnable type. Their diameter was 3,100 meters. At the same time, they also acted as heavy aircraft carriers, having on board 170 fighters and dozens of shuttles. When, many thousands of years later, the Trade Federation created their robotic warfleet, it was the inaccessible that partly inspired them. At the same time, the Republic's opponents had other classification systems. For example, the Kratos had their largest warships, simply called the Attack Spike, attack ship, strike ship, whatever you want to call it. This type of ship is called a Supremacy-class attack ship. When the naval leaders of the Galactic Republic encountered this Judas Marvel during the Great Sith War, they couldn't think of what class to assign it to. In terms of armament, it was something between a heavy cruiser and a battleship of some races. But in terms of its role in combat, the Kratos ship was both a battleship and an aircraft carrier, for it traveled with 144 ships, CX-133 Chaos fighters. In the end, the Republicans did not bother to find out what class the vessels they encountered belonged to. What were the bucket-headed fellows of Mandalorian appearance in those years? And they had two extremes, either something very large and brutally armed with an equally brutal crew, or something very small, fast and attacking suddenly like diarrhea from a stale, dry ration. The Mandalorians didn't have ships of intermediate classes and sizes, which is odd, or they just forgot to tell us about them and didn't show them in the comics and games, which is unlikely. So, what did the Mandalorians fly and fight? The biggest ships in the Mandalorian armada were these beauties. Candosi-type dreadnoughts, which is Mandalorian for ruthless. That's a beautiful name. Mind you, the term dreadnought was not used in the Republican Navy at the time. The Republicans simply called it a battleship. The ship was 1,360 meters long. A very large beast, not inferior in combat capabilities to the best ships of its time. Thick armor, a lot of guns, a spacious hangar, and inside there were up to 30,000 Mandalorian warriors, dreaming to run, kill, and in every possible way to overcome the difficulties of war. And to make it easier, Candosi was kept company by Kermit-type battleships, Mandalorian for killer, also a very telling name. The Mandalorians were fond of that sort of thing. Yes, by the way, the Mandalorians had the terms dreadnought and battleship synonymously. It is noteworthy that when thousands of years later the guys from the Rendley Star Drive Corporation created their dreadnought-class heavy cruiser, they were inspired by the design and construction experience of the Mandalorian Candosi-type dreadnought. And then the Mandalorians went on to do all sorts of little things. Almost all of the Mandalorians' small ships, not counting fighters, of course, were also landing craft. And this despite the fact that the Mandalorians had full-fledged landing craft. Here's an example. A storm ship of the Jahavier type was 188 meters long. Its name translates to ambush. In fact, that's what Jahavirians used to do when they weren't bringing heavily armed Mandalorian fighters to the front lines to knock off Republic youths. Or here's a smaller example, an assault gunboat of the Terok type. It means ruthless in Mandalorian. But she was ruthless not only for her enemies, but also for her own crew, for it was a below-average pleasure to steer such a cuttlefish. Please note that in the Mandalorian classification, there was no frigate, corvette, or cruiser class. Everything huge and protected by cannons was called dreadnoughts or battleships, and everything small was called assault ships or gunboats. It wasn't until thousands of years later, especially in the movie period, that the Mandalorians would use the terms corvette and build ships of intermediate classes. The Crusader corvette is a good example. It turned out to be a surprisingly good ship. A very good ship. Even the Imperials found a use for it. And it's that rare case when the Galactic Empire and then its splinters adopted something Mandalorian-made. But oops, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let's go back in time. 300 years pass, and a new session of the Great Galactic Scale morass called the Great Galactic War begins. It lasted 28 years, from 3681 to 3653 BC Yavin. Immediately after it began the Cold War, which then evolved into the next Great War, which in turn was interrupted by a war with the Eternal Empire of Zakul, and so on. In general, the period of the Great Game, SWTOR, Star Wars, the Old Republic. Those were fun times. Warfare was loved, skillful, and had something to fight with. The degradation of technology, the example of the new Sith Wars, had not come yet. In the relatively peaceful period that came after the Mandalorian Wars, the so-called Jedi Civil War, and similar military mass events, the Republic fleet didn't need especially large warships. They had no one to fight. The Galactic Republic had become the major military and economic power in the galaxy, and everyone had to reckon with it, even the Hutts. Now the tasks of the Republic fleet became different: to destroy pirates, to chase smugglers, and to force the peace of the member states of the Republic if they made war with each other without first coordinating it with the Galactic Senate. For how could it be to go to war without the approval of the Senate and honorable men, most of whom represented the interests of the financially strongest worlds there? It had always been so in a galaxy far, far away. In the new era, Centurions, Interdictors, and Impregnables gradually disappeared from the Republican fleet. The focus was on small ships of corvette and frigate classes, mostly the same hammerheads. By the way, the Republic continued to use them until the end of the new Sith Wars, that is, almost 3,000 years. Light cruisers and frigates were cheaper to maintain. They did not require a large crew and could be produced quickly and in large numbers. Sverna-class hammerhead corvettes were gradually replaced by the already mentioned CR-12 type Thranta-class corvettes. Not wanting to waste government money, the Thranta was used to build a variety of ships, including landing ships. There were also smaller corvettes, such as the Defender-class light corvette. This is the one we fly when we play as Jedi class. It's a very beautiful ship, both inside and out. I like it even better than the Fury-class Imperial Interceptor. By the way, here's another difference in classification. The term corvette was not used in the Sith Empire fleet. The Fury was a typical light corvette by its size and role in battle, but was called by the Sith the term interceptor. Interceptor. The class is essentially the same, but the names are different. We will come back to the ships of the Sith Empire, but for now I will continue about the Republican fleet. The battleship class had disappeared altogether by the beginning of the Great War. The largest Republic ships of those years were half-kilometer cruisers of the Valor type. To be precise, they were aircraft-carrying cruisers with powerful cannon armament, but they also had on board a solid air group of 110 fighters, 40 fighter bombers, and up to 25 landing and cargo shuttles. Beautiful ships. Mostly they acted as planetary defense ships and, on rare occasions, were used as a powerful argument of the Republican Senate in the above-mentioned local conflicts. But when the Galactic Republic was attacked by the Sith Empire under the leadership of the ever-living Emperor Vitiate, the Republic fleet became drastically uncomfortable. Because of the aforementioned challenges, valor was scarce for the Republic. No one felt the need to build such cruisers by the thousands. But the Sith Empire had many ships of similar power, as many as a fool has rappers. The Imperials had been preparing for 300 years and had built many ships. Fortunately for the Republic, they had vast manufacturing facilities on their side. First of all, the shipyards of planets Kuat and Corellia. The stern men rolled up their sleeves and got so enthusiastic that in a few years the numerical superiority of the Imperials was reduced to parity. And then the numerical superiority was on the side of the Republicans, although it was more in ground battles in the number of soldiers. By the end of the Great Sith War, the Sith outnumbered the Republicans only in ship technology, making the two sides roughly equal. Realizing that valor was a good thing, but they wanted something bigger with better armor and armament, the Republic shipbuilders began producing line cruisers and battleships in small batches, or even piece by piece. Unfortunately, they did not think to modernize ships of older designs, such as the previously mentioned Centurions. Instead, new designs emerged, including superlancers with hull lengths of several kilometers. For example, such a giant was in one of the biggest battles of the war, the Battle of Hoth, in 3,665 BBY. Hundreds of Republic cruisers and battleships fought hundreds of Imperial ones. They fought for days, which is a very long time for Star Wars, and the losses were appropriate then, also hundreds of ships. There were lost even experimental battleships that had not yet passed the test program. The largest and most powerful of these was the Star of Coruscant, a battleship at least 4 kilometers long, armed with hundreds of cannons, including particularly powerful experimental guns. The Republicans labeled it a super dreadnought, a unique term not applied to any other ship in ancient Republic history. The Sith didn't care what it was called, and focusing all their attention on it, hit the ship and dropped the giant onto the surface of Hoth, driving it into the atmosphere. But the ship's armor was so strong that it was virtually undamaged. Most of the crew and most of the electronics and weapons, oddly enough, survived. That's the Republican quality. Then one of the galaxy's largest pirate groups, the Whitemouth, used the remains of the Star of Coruscant as their city, their fortress. It's a perfect solution. The armor is thick, some of the cannons still work, and even some of the reactors function. It's warm, cozy, and safe. On this ship, or rather on what is left of it, we can run in subalutor. Another experimental giant, the battleship Furious Sword, also fought and died over Hoth. The most remarkable thing was not the ship itself, but its armament, the so-called null guns. This battle also featured several ships of an atypical class for the Republican Navy of those years, such as several aircraft carriers. They were a rarity because the Republican Navy didn't need them. The same Valor-type cruisers had a fairly spacious hangar. The type of aircraft carriers and their numeric letter index are not reported to us, and by name we know only one aircraft carrier, Conradus Vindicator. He, by the way, was also lost in this battle. Its remains can be found in the ship graveyard while walking around Hoth. This is at the end of the planetary storyline. The Sith reciprocated their visions by bringing many interesting ships to Hoth, though not as large. For example, in the game you can find the remains of the cruiser Ambria's Fury. A few kilometers away from it lies the same type of cruiser, Fatality, which can be translated as Doom. Admit it, at the word Fatality, you also remembered Mortal Kombat. But those were rarities, and there were two main heavy ships in the Imperial Sith fleet. The mainstay of the Sith Empire's fleet were the Harrower-class dreadnoughts. More specifically, they were called dreadnoughts in the Sith Empire. Again, the term dreadnought was not used in the Republic Navy at that time. The super dreadnought Coruscant Star was an exception. The Republicans categorized the Imperial dissectors as line cruisers. They were 800 meters long, considerably larger than the Republic Valor, which, recall, was about 500 meters long. Though in terms of internal volume, the difference was not so tangible. There were also smaller versions of the dissectors. The Imperials still called them dreadnoughts, and the Republicans called them cruisers or heavy cruisers. I'm referring now to Project BSX-5's dissector. It was 600 meters long. The dissectors reflected the same ideology as the Republican Valor, being a hybrid of a line cruiser with a powerful artillery armament and an aircraft carrier with a large air group. A few of the dissectors' hangars nested 96 light fighters, 32 bombers, and 35 shuttles. The multi-role support ships in the Sith Empire fleet were Terminus-type cruisers. Yes, once again we find Latin in Star Wars. The Sith called this class the Destroyer. The air group on the planet Terminus, despite their size, was small. Only 16 fighters and bombers, plus 3 shuttles. But there were plenty of cannons. It was with Terminus most often had to meet the Republican fleet. Despite their auxiliary role, Terminus often became flagships of lords and darts. For example, it was the Terminus that held the flag of the great warrior and strategist Darth Mar. However, his flagship differed significantly from the serial ships of this type in size and firepower. But he was one of the first faces of the masks in the Empire to fly a more powerful ship. Another member of the Dark Council, the Darth Carid, also had an enlarged Terminus. This madam was killed along with her unique ship in a battle near the planet Duro in 3640 BC Yavin. Her ship was named the Spear of Power. Another characteristic ship of the era were the GCTs, Gauge-class transport, of the type Challenge. A Gauge class, in case anyone doesn't know, is a large landing craft. I cited a military transport for a reason. The ship was originally designed as a transport version of the Terminus, but then, based on the Challenge itself, there were cruisers of the same name. For example, Captain Revinal Orzik's famous Black Claw was a cruiser, not a Gauge class. More precisely, it was a destroyer, according to the terminology of the Sith Empire. After the demise of the Sith Empire, the huge warships in the Republic, Hath, and other military fleets did not disappear. Apparently, the people finally realized that frigates, light and heavy cruisers were necessary, but battleships were also needed. The only known giant of those post-war years, also in service with the Republic for thousands of years, was the Invincible-class heavy cruiser. The Republicans referred to these ships as heavy cruisers, but other nations, based on the Invincible's role in battle, called them battleships or dreadnoughts. In this particular case, the term battleship and dreadnought were synonymous, though usually battleships and dreadnoughts in Star Wars are referred to as ships of different classes. But more on that later when it comes to the Anaxis classification system. The Invincibles appeared shortly before the 17th Alsacan War, this time the last war. It was also the fastest of all the Alsacan Wars, lasting only a few months, in 3017 before Yavin. By the way, the longest in this series of wars was the Second Alsacan War, or the Alsacan Conflict, as it is also called. It was fought for 800 years. The war began in 16200 and ended in 15400 before Yavin. It was fought for so long because of the turtle speed of the ships. Flying in hyperspace was as slow and dangerous back then as traveling in the Warhammer universe in warp. If there's a Jedi you can put in the navigator's chair, good, even just fine. If not, crawl to the next sector for a month or 2 or 3. The length of the heavy cruiser Invincible was 11 meters. There were variants slightly larger and slightly smaller. These were classic artillery ships, with an emphasis on line combat and board salvos. Although, as is customary in Star Wars, the Invincible had a spacious hangar that could hold 90 to 100 fighters and bombers. Another era of huge line ships, monstrous battleships, only ended in the year 2500 BC Yavin. Due to the cessation of large-scale wars and the general economic crisis in the galaxy, smaller ships, mostly cruisers, light cruisers and corvettes, were once again in vogue. For some reason, there were no frigate classes at that time. This continued for half a millennium, until 2000 before Yavin, when the new Sith Wars began. A series of incredibly destructive wars from small to great, spanning 1,000 years and culminating in the victory of the Republic and the Jedi Order in the 7th Battle of Ruusan. These wars were anything but. from the still-used hammerheads, now called light cruisers, and other relatively small starships, to huge, multi-kilometer ships, compared to which the previously mentioned Invincible was a relatively small cruiser. However, I cannot detail the story in this case. Specific examples are few. In official sources, only general theses are voiced. After the new Sith Wars, with the beginning of the Ruusan Reformation, some interesting processes in the military affairs of the galaxy began. The decisions made by the Senate and the Supreme Chancellor at that time orked all the states with the object of the Galactic Republic down to the Clone Wars. And so, triumphantly for the Galactic Republic, the new Sith Wars ended. The Sith are defeated and, according to the Jedi, completely destroyed. 2.5 people in the entire galaxy knew of Darth Bane and Darth Xanar at the time, and they became a little dead soon after. The Galactic Republic, which had not known peace for centuries, suddenly lost its main adversary, both military and political. At the same time, the powers that be had a new political adversary, the Jedi. During the new Sith Wars of hundreds of years, only the Jedi could hold the office of Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, which did not please many power-hungry citizens. In addition, the followers of the light side of the Force held all the key positions in the state, from the Minister of Defense to the Minister of Finance. Because of the undivided Jedi rule, the Republic actually turned into a theocratic state, as the Sith Empire of Emperor Vishite had been thousands of years before. Fortunately, the Jedi showed prudence, deciding to hand over the management of the state to mere mortals, that is, ordinary people, not Force users, in no way connected with the Jedi Order. The reasons for giving up the power were more than substantial. The fact is that after the long confrontation between the two orders, many ordinary people were afraid of the Jedi and their mystical power. But even more were those who saw the Jedi as nothing more than warmongers. Moreover, the Jedi Order was beyond the control of the Senate and could act as it pleased, ignoring all legal norms. But more importantly, it was the Jedi who commanded all of the Republic's armed forces during the war, giving them a strong argument for hegemony in the galaxy. The leading politicians of the Republic needed to eliminate the political and military dominance of the Jedi Order by any means necessary. The first swallow in this process was the new Supreme Chancellor. Tarsus Valorum became the first non-Jedi Chancellor in 4 centuries. He is credited with the following historic words: "I want you Jedi to answer to an elected authority that represents the interests of the citizens of the Republic. This is not an attempt to take power into your own hands. The Jedi Council will still be in charge of your order, but they will operate under the oversight of the judicial branch of the Senate. This is the only opportunity to heal the scars left by the Sith warriors." All further political decisions of Tarsus Valorum have gone down in history as the Ruusan Reformation. In particular, the Reformation meant the disbanding of the unified Republican fleet army and the transfer of responsibilities and defense to the states themselves and their fleets. In brief, Valorum wanted to enact the aphorism, "It's a sink or swim world." Did it do good or harm? Yes and no. For one thing, the Jedi instantly lost a key role in the political life of the Republic, though they retained significant influence over the Chancellor's Senate. And the Republic lost the ability to impose its will by force on the other constituent nations. Now, the Senate, in case of conflicts, had to negotiate with the rulers of individual planets and systems to engage their local, small and motley armies and fleets. The consequences were not long in coming. At once, hundreds of small states, which had hitherto feared an armed visit from the Republican Navy in case of mutiny, were able to openly declare their independence. Liberation movements from small acts of defiance to large-scale rebellion have blossomed on once Republican planets. The Hutts and other criminal cartels rose to prominence on the same wave. Soon, the Republican local governments began to rapidly increase their own armed forces, remembering the age-old maxim, "He who does not want to feed his own army will soon feed someone else's." Future was determined to curb the regional arms race, then occupying the minds of several planetary governments, and to limit the growth of local fleets. Supreme Chancellor Tarsus Valorum imposed a limit on the size and armament of large warships. According to his law, passed by the Senate, cruisers and battleships were not to exceed 600 meters in size. The hyperdrive speed was to be only Class 5 by the standards of the time, and the ship's navigational computers were not to be able to hyper-jump freely, that is, without the use of fixed navigational beacons beyond their national borders. A small armed force of the Justice Corps was created to oversee the enforcement of the decree, as well as to generally control the situation. Naturally, this did not suit the government of the small subjects of the Republic, which had barely had time to start accelerated militarization. The worlds of the middle and outer rings were especially indignant, as they traditionally had plenty of people willing to take advantage of other people's lands and property, and where territorial disputes were often settled by volleys of turbolasers. There was only one way to prevent the aggression of a neighbor: by showing him the muzzle of a larger caliber cannon mounted on a larger ship. Local militarization was also facilitated by the fact that the Republic transferred decommissioned cruisers, frigates, and corvettes to these very defensive fleets. Wealthy nations who sometimes owned entire systems and sectors were able to freely purchase lightly supported ships that only a year ago had fiercely fought the Sith fleet. And the remnants of the Sith fleet have not disappeared without a trace either. The resourceful powers had pulled it to pieces as quickly as a crowd of hungry people suddenly discovered a nobody's cake in front of their noses. However, there were those who feared a resumption of war, disarmed the ships they had gotten, and left them in reserve just in case. As it was to be expected, free warships and Senate subsidies for the organization of defensive fleets went to those who were closer to the Coruscant Trough. The result was the traditional strengthening of the core and inner ring worlds, and weakening of the outer and middle ring planets. Everyone on the outskirts had to fight with Republican bureaucrats and officials from the Justice Corps, asking to remove or reduce restrictions on the size and armament of their warships, as well as begging the ever-stingy Senate for subsidies to build and maintain their own fleets. As a result, common sense prevailed in the governments of a number of local states of the middle and outer rings, and the realization that the threat of an external invasion was far more dangerous than all the Senate cries of discontent and sanctions. Unwilling to be satisfied with the leftovers from the Republic fleet, and realizing that with old and worn-out ships it would be impossible to defend themselves against the enemy, the arms race resumed on the periphery. The peripheries, for obvious reasons, did not get new and slightly used ships. After a while, the industrialized nations of the middle and outer rings were able to build cruisers and battleships of a size the galaxy had not seen for millennia. There were ships that had not been built even during the New Sith Wars. In these turbulent times, printouts with ridiculous demands from Valorum and senators, representatives of most of the outlying systems could find use only in the latrine, after the stock of royal, presidential, or dictatorial toilet paper had run out. But such neglect could only be demonstrated by a state with a powerful economy and good troops. And if it didn't, well, you can see how it could end. Senate sanctions on one side, a greedy and belligerent neighbor on the other side. It begs the logical question: why did the Senate's limit on the size of ships exist for almost 1,000 years? It has been violated from time to time. But that's what a republic is. To keep in the list of valid state acts the decrees and directives even if they contradicted common sense. But there was common sense, and a good one at that. The abolition of 600 meters was opposed by the Galactic Senate, whose senators represented the interests of the most financially powerful entities of the Republic. As the saying goes, all animals in the forest are equal, but some are more equal. This and other laws of the Ruusan Reformation were often used by clever politicians who had in their retinue meticulous archivists who could find the right piece of paper in the bottomless archives of the Republic, so that at the right moment they could wave it in front of the nose of an exploding neighbor in a system or sector, accusing him of possessing undemocratic military forces. Aye. After such an embarrassment, the unfortunate owner of a poorly armed boat with a length of, for example, 601 meters, instead of the required 600 meters, could be punished with a credit card in the form of sanctions against his state. And good neighbors, happy to achieve justice and democracy, got the opportunity to run their hands, paws, tentacles, fins, and other raking limbs into other people's pockets and grab whatever they wanted, while the unfortunate senator was breaking through the bureaucratic wall in the form of commissions, committees, agencies, ministries, handing out bribes along the way. For otherwise, Republican democracy doesn't work. I love bureaucracy. It can be so much fun. What was the result? In the end, the Ruusan Reformation led not to peace in the galaxy, but to a change in the form of military and political confrontation between the subjects of the Galactic Republic and the states that were not part of the Republic or had managed to leave it. In doing so, weapons became as plentiful in the galaxy as cockroaches in a dirty kitchen. Worst of all, the Republic had completely lost the ability to influence the military and political actions of its own subjects and to prevent conflicts between them. And what was more, the Republic was not eager to regain control of the situation. Well, what was happening on the diplomatic front of the outer and middle ring worlds can be expressed in the following quatrain. Any protest you make, we will answer. We have a big battleship, and you don't. The original version of this late 19th century poem was about machine guns, and it was started by the British, who were greedy for other people's goods, looking at the attempts of Indians and some Africans to gain independence. Over time, the military and political tensions in the Republic waned, though vocal wars continued to rumble periodically throughout the galaxy, especially on the periphery. Shipbuilding declined with them. The monstrous battleships were once again a thing of the past. Many poor worlds whose governments were unable to put their hands into the general Republican coffers found themselves virtually defenseless in the face of pirates, slave traders, and the ambitions of petty despots. During the same period, megacorporations began to acquire their own military fleets with impunity. Megacorporations even subjugated entire planets and planetary systems. Megacorporations and rich subjects of the Republic in the following centuries began to use the fleet for fixing of the economic influence and development of new territories rich in natural resources. Moreover, colonization of new planets in the outer ring was conducted without regard for the rights of indigenous races, and without sparing the aborigines from slavery. Sometimes this exploitation was so blatant that the Senate was forced to intervene. One attempt to intervene was made in 704 BC Yavin to no avail. Still, the nearly 1,000 years after the Ruusan Reformation were a period of relative peace. For centuries, the military and political situation remained unchanged, and the core of justice was still as inept at upholding law and order even in the inner ring. Some of the localized conflicts even resulted in the actual extermination of certain races. For example, around 320 years before Yavin, the Nozavioga War took place. Some localized conflicts could last for centuries. An example of such a confrontation is the Meli-Dadan Civil War, which lasted 200 years from 244 to 44 BC Yavin. But to be fair, there were many localized conflicts that the Jedi managed to resolve by organizing peace talks, or aggressive negotiations, as Anakin called them. Without this necessary political offshoot from the narrative, the next part of the story would not be as curious and exemplary. Now we will talk about the extremely clever and cunning comrades from the Kuat sector, where the galaxy-wide known shipyards were located around the capital planet of the same name. The giant Kuat battleships Procurator, Mandator, and Praetor, mentioned in passing in the recent Minotaur video, were built in these yards. Characteristically, this trio and their modifications are in both old and new canon. And we even saw Mandator 4 in the movie, in Episode 8. This piece of the story is illustrated with fan-made 3D models of the Procurator and official Praetor. All the images belong to Peru by the same person, the famous artist Ansel Xiao. Yeah, so somehow his images of Praetor made it into the official sources, but the Procurator somehow didn't. Or not yet. Some of his fan works have already become official because of debt. Suffice it to recall the history of the appearance in canon of an illustration of the Allegiance-class battlecruiser. The Allegiance-class battlecruiser. So maybe it will be Praetor's turn too. There's a small But the Praetor in the pictures is a representation of the battleship Kormcha, the flagship of Admiral Mills and Gale. It was a ship already modernized project, Praetor II, which is a small series and were built already in the Imperial period. And the model is based on drawings from an ancient comic book of the main Marvel series with the simple name Star Wars, issue #60, which went to press back on March 16, 1982, when Star Wars was represented by only 2 movies, the 4th and 5th episodes. As far back as 200 years before the Clone Wars, or to be more precise, in 219 BC Yavin, Kuat engineers graced the galaxy with a Procurator-type line cruiser. One of the first apparent ancestors of the Star Destroyers, it had a number of characteristic design elements that were later adopted by the Venators, and from them by the ISRs. The Procurator-class Star battlecruiser, was 2,500 meters long, much larger than the size allowed at that time. Let me remind you that ships of no more than 600 meters in length were allowed, but nobody cared much about it. Then the Procurator was replaced by an even more impressive line cruiser, a ship of the Praetor type, already 4 kilometers long. In the case of the Praetor, the Kuatians again did not care what restrictions there were for ships in the rest of the Republic. They built it for their own loved ones, and for some rich countries too. In fact, the modernized Praetorians, a century and a half old, had fought in the Clone Wars on the Republic side. One of them, oddly named Battalion, commanded by Admiral Adar Talon of the 12th Sector Army, had even fought on the side of the Empire, dashing around the fringes of the galaxy, chasing Confederate forces that hadn't made it. They were very serious ships. By the way, the Rebel Alliance used an honestly stolen reactor from one of the Praetorians at their main base on Hotta. Quietly stole it and walked away, called finding it. The old fusion reactor worked properly and, among other things, powered the powerful ion cannon of anti-space defense, which you saw in the 5th episode. And the huge Praetor was not enough for the Kuatians in their quest for gigantomania. They presented the galaxy with a huge 8-kilometer dreadnought like the Manticore. It appeared in the year 42 to Yavin. These superlancers were eagerly used by the fleet leaders of the Grand Army of the Republic of War Clones. At the beginning of the war, 7 of them had been built. Then came an even more powerful version with improved armament and stronger armor, Manticore II, and then the 3rd model was produced. In the current so-called New Canon, there's a 4th-generation Manticore, a siege dreadnought of the Manticore IV type, a huge 7.5-kilometer-long monster, which due to Hux's military stupidity and narcissism was lost at the beginning of the 8th episode. The First Order had several ships of this type. The ship destroyed in episode 8 was named Fulminatrix, but back in time again. The Kuatians at first expected that the Senate would sanction them for such artistry, and at first they were not too harsh. But then they saw that the Senate not only did not impose sanctions on them, but put them down, and not sanctions, but a dick. You pay your taxes? Good. No genocides? Fine. Build whatever you want, just don't go on a rampage. Of course, the legislative poffagism and procedural myopia of the Republican Senate was generously paid for by the big uncles who pocketed the senators an innuanced amount of credit cards. That wasn't the only thing the senators turned a blind eye to. When they had to, even the tough-as-boiled-egg Mandalorian warriors could resort to corruption, knowing who, where, and how much they could get. That's why Mandal Motors built stuff and sold it to people. Hey gangsters, you want a heavy tank? Go ahead, buy one, here's the price tag. Hey pirates, you want a cruiser by any chance? Oh, do you? Well, here's a good ship for you, and it's cheap. In the decades before the Clone Wars, the frequency of local conflicts began to increase, leading to general militarization and the evolution of warships, which had finally begun, after nearly a millennium of relative peace, to almost come to a halt, and in some places even to go backwards towards regression and degradation. Some of the wars in the run-up to the Clone Wars have dealt a serious blow to the Republic's reputation as the main regulator of political life in the galaxy. Among them, the following are worth highlighting. The Anduin Wars, which began in Yavin 57 and lasted 18 years until Yavin 39, the Stark Hyperspace War, Yavin 44, The Hak War, also known as the Yamria Crisis from Yavin 42 to Yavin 34, the War for Control of Malistar, Yavin 34, the Yinchori Rebellion, Yavin 33, the Crisis on Naboo, and the conflict on Antara 4. And there were many such wars. And how many were civil wars, such as the already mentioned Melody Dawn War or the Sepan Civil War? While the first was limited to one system, the second was fought in the entire sector. All these conflicts may not seem to be very large on a galactic scale, but they were very telling. The wars demonstrated the weakness and disgusting behavior of the Republic, from which not only individual planets but also planetary systems and even sectors had already begun to withdraw. The Galactic Republic had 1024 sectors, with 69 million systems colonized in some way. How many planets were in the Republic is, alas, unknown. But thanks to the Essential Atlas Encyclopedia, we know that the Galactic Empire, whose size was slightly smaller than the Galactic Republic, included only 1,750,000 fully colonized planets. Can you imagine the magnitude of this crisis? Many nations in the galaxy had their own system of classifying warships. There were simply no unified standards. The mess in classification concerned not only military, but also transport ships. For example, the term cruiser, which it would seem should be used only in the military fleet, was sometimes assigned to civilian vessels, such as yachts. An example is the so-called civilian cruiser of the Citadel type. There were other equally strange metamorphoses. One can remember the outlandish-looking line cruiser of the Cal type. In armament and dimensions, 307 meters, this ship corresponded to the frigates of its time, like the Nebulon B frigates. Also the Trade Federation Bagel that was called a battleship by the bargainers and then the separatists involuntarily comes to mind. Or here is another illustrative example, a ship of the Guardian type, which is only 42 meters long. It would seem that it is a typical older ship, or a small corvette for catching pirates and customs inspection of cargo. There are tons of them flying around the galaxy. But no, in some nations with small fleets, they called it a cruiser, a light cruiser. In states with more representative fleets, guards called already corvette, and the cruiser was called something bigger. For example, ships of the Carrack type. And here is another curious example. The picture shows a Corellian gunboat of the DP-20 project. What was a gunboat for the Grand Army of the Republic, for the fleets of the Galactic Empire and the New Republic, was considered a frigate in some states and paramilitary organizations. A number of smaller nations continued to use their own ship classification systems. Given all this mess, attempts to clearly categorize starships sailing through the galaxy were constantly occurring, and all of them proved to be unsuccessful to a greater or lesser extent. But despite this, attempts were made again and again. It was only on the eve of the Clone Wars, when the military and politicians of the Galactic Republic states finally got tired of all this motley variety. The learned minds at Anaxis War College, one of the most prestigious military schools in the Galactic Republic, have decided once again, and this time to finally establish a clear classification of warships. The classification they created was called the Anaxis system, the Anaxis War Coach system. The size of the ship was taken as the main criterion. In the case of naval ships, it would be called displacement, and in space, space displacement. The new system took into account all parameters, length, width, height, and internal volume, and it was logical. The larger a warship was, the more space it had for storing weapons, installing more powerful reactors, deflectors, and other military equipment. The smallest large ship, capital ship, also sometimes called capital ship, were recognized as corvettes and gunboats. These, despite their different names, were in fact the same class. It was decided to start from them. So, 100 to 200 meters long, corvette or gunboat. Example, Marauder-type corvettes, CR-90 corvettes, or DP-20 gunboats. 200 to 400 meters. This is a frigate. Example, EF-76 Nebulon B escort frigates, or the Ulan frigates. The name can be translated as lance carrier. 400 to 600 meters light cruiser, medium cruiser or cruiser, a neutron star-type cruiser, a medium strike cruiser or a light cruiser of the Mont Calamari project MC-40A, There were a great many such ships, and a medium cruiser often did not differ from a simple cruiser in armament. Therefore, they were reduced to one size, 600 to 1,000 meters. Heavy cruiser. Examples: Fearless, or a heavy cruiser like the Dreadnought. Heavy cruiser of the Majestic type, Star Destroyer type, Gladiator type, or Aquamators. The latter were in modifications not only BDCs but also cruisers, 1,000 to 5,000 meters. These were line cruisers or battleships. For example, a battleship like the Emperor-type Star Destroyer, aka Imperial, a line cruiser, a Star Destroyer like the Fidelity, a line cruiser like the Procurator, or a line cruiser like the Bastion. Over 5,000 meters in length, these are dreadnoughts, also sometimes called super lancers. In this case, it is the Dreadnought class. Not to be confused with Dreadnought-class ships. Type and class, both in Star Wars and in the real world, are completely different terms, especially in the domestic navy. Examples of dreadnoughts, super battleships. These are, of course, the superstar destroyers. These are the well-known Executor-class Star Dreadnought, Overlord and Eclipse, or less-known SPRs, such as the Bellator or the Assertor. But not only the Galactic Empire had its own super lancers. The New Republic also distinguished itself in this field when it acquired the appropriate industrial potential and the necessary amount of money. You're looking at a Viscount-class Superlink, a huge thing 17 kilometers long with 5,000 weapons, of which only turbo lasers 4,000. And on top of that, with almost bottomless hangars that hold over 1,000 aircraft. It was a monster to be reckoned with. The New Republic had several of these ships, but the Viscount was not the only thing the New Republic fleet was proud of. There was another huge super battleship in their fleet, this time of Corellian manufacture, a ship of the Strident type. In this case, we had to use a fan drawing, as there is no official one. However, the ship is shown exactly as it was written on the pages of the Jedi Eclipse and Betrayal novels. Interestingly enough, the New Republic invented their own class of ship for the Strident and Viscount, Star Defender. Although under the Anaxis classification system, they were dreadnoughts, super lancers. Star Destroyers were a separate category, and they fell into a separate category altogether. This was because Star Destroyers could be called ships of different classes, an aircraft carrier like the Venator, battleship, Emperor or Victory, a cruiser, Gladiator, and so on. And here is a very important note. It was originally stated in the official franchise sources, and sort of inside a galaxy far, far away, that the Anaxis system called Star Destroyers ships between 1,000 and 2,000 meters long, regardless of their class. That was how ships like the Rebellion in the introduction, which is labeled Carrier Destroyer, got there. Naturally, only the Republicans themselves called them so, which did not please the Separatists themselves, because the same conduct was their dreadnought. I liked this feint of the ears and the Kuatians, who wanted to trademark the term destroyer, and especially Star Destroyer, for their wedge-designed ships. However, if you consider a Star Destroyer to be ships between 1,000 and 2,000 meters long, as stated in the encyclopedia with the Essential Guide to Warfare, there is confusion. After all, there is a Gladiator-type Star Destroyer that is only 600 meters long, or a Victory-class Star Destroyer that is 900 meters long. Or, in an interesting case, the Bakura-class Star Destroyer, which is only 850 meters long. And there are Star Destroyers that are over 2 kilometers long. For example, the Venator Air, a Secutor-class Star Destroyer with a hull length of 2,200 meters. That's in the original Star Wars expanded universe. But there are exactly the same mishaps in the so-called new canon. For example, the backbone of the First Order fleet is a Star Destroyer of the Reborn type, almost 3 kilometers long, 2915 meters to be exact, or the Zistan Star Destroyer, a major misunderstanding of Episode 9. It's 2,406 meters long. This classification system was invented by Jason Fry, the author of the aforementioned encyclopedia, to help explain some of the confusion in the classification of warships. But with Star Destroyers, this undoubtedly very respected and talented man frankly gave a blow and only introduced even more confusion. Looking at this, Jason Fry had to make some clarifications with the permission of the Star Wars franchise owner, and with the help of Lucas Licensing, who was replacing the story group at the time and making sure that there were no contradictions in the canon. So, as stated at the beginning of the thread, Star Destroyers is a term for ships of different classes, going in a separate category. As you have noticed, there are no aircraft carriers among the classes of warships. When the learned men in Anaxis were composing this classification, there were almost no aircraft carriers in the fathoms of most of the sovereign galaxy. The thing is, most of the big gunships in Star Wars have an internal hangar and carry a decent air group inside. Therefore, aircraft carriers are kind of apart and are generally rare. They were later categorized separately, also based on their size, although it is not known which length belonged to which subclass of aircraft carrier. Here are a few examples. Light aircraft carrier, Fire of Quasar, 340 meters long. The Tun Falk type ship, 500 meters long. Escort aircraft carrier, Defender-class assault carrier, 700 meters long. Or here's another New Republic aircraft carrier called a fleet carrier. To most others, it would have been considered a heavy carrier. The Persistent-class aircraft carrier, 1,040 meters long. It was based on the Nebula-type Star Destroyer. And finally, a heavy aircraft carrier of the Galactica type, 1,600 meters long. These flew the flag of the Galactic Alliance. Everything seems to be fine. The Anaxis classification system is quite convenient, and within the most distant and distant galaxy, it does not cause any particular contradictions. It was adopted by the vast majority of the states that were part of the Galactic Republic and then the Galactic Empire. But the Confederation of Independent Systems, aka the Separatists, understandably ignored the next Republican paperwork and legislation. Separatists lived perfectly well with almost 5-kilometer conquerors, which they, without wisecracking, dubbed heavy cruisers, and with generous ones, which at the length of 825 meters were considered to be only frigates and lived and did not blow their mouths, and the opinion of the Republicans is known on what they were spinning. Some isolated nations also ignored the Anaxis system. The most common large warship of the Nova type was considered a line cruiser, even though it was only 400 meters long. Mind you, in the Anaxis system, a line cruiser is a ship over a kilometer long. The Rebel Alliance and later the New Republic did not always adhere to the Anaxis system, though they generally tried to explore it. For example, the Rebels and New Republicans avoided the terms battleship and line cruiser when designing and building new ships for a long time, and at first they shunned Star Destroyers as a legacy of the cursed Tsarism. Then they came to their senses and adopted ships called Star Destroyers, like the Nebula or the Republic. Mon Calamari ships of the MC-80, MC-80A, MC-80B, and MC-90 projects were called heavy cruisers, or by their own uncomplicated term, Star Cruiser, although in their role and size they corresponded to line cruisers. In the so-called new canon, it's exactly the same story. Plus, there are new ships of Mon Calamarian construction. In Outcast 1, we were introduced to the MC-75 Star Cruiser, and in Episode 8, the MC-85. The 75th was 1,204 meters long, but the MC-85 was much larger, 3,438 meters long, 706 meters wide, and 461 meters high. That's a huge ship by Star Wars standards. In the Anaxis system, it was a full-fledged battleship, but the New Republicans assigned it to its own class, Heavy Star Cruiser. And when the Yuuzhan Vong came, the military of the New Republic racked their brains 10 times before they figured out how to classify their living ships. In terms of size, it won't work. Ships are alive. They grow during their whole life. In terms of armament, well, there is no way here either. Each Vong ship could differ greatly in the number of barrels. In general, the matter is as useless as an attempt to classify Tyranid ships in the Warhammer 40000 universe, though there in Imperium of Mankind they also tried to systematize them somehow. We have to know who we kill and who kills us. It is human nature to put everything into a single system, to catalog, to classify. Such is the long and complicated history of shipbuilding and classifying warships in Star Wars.